apex body which trains the administrators of India, who then solve the complex problems of world's most diverse country and the largest democracy. We all know knowledge, when applied, miracles happen. After shower of wisdom from the speakers, I would request Dr. Chopra to enlighten us with application of distilled thoughts of the session in the context of India and world. We also have Dr. B.N. Ramesh, Director General of Police PMR West Bengal, a lifelong student who has 3 PhDs to his name. Dear educators, I'm hopeful our sincere efforts will benefit the entire human race. Together, we will make a conscious world with guidance, support, and leadership at various levels. We will build a lot, L-O-T, leaders of tomorrow who will be confident problem solvers and conscious global citizens. Now, before I invite Chairman of the Boston Pledge, Dr. Partha Ghosh, the modern day Renaissance man who is always busy helping governments and corporations around the world, solving critical problems. And personally, I look forward to the EDSP sessions to experience his depth and vastness of various subjects, which brings simple solution to complex problems. Now, I will be inviting Dr. Jahangir Sultan, President of the Boston Pledge, who has been a pillar of the Boston Pledge since last 20 years from its inception. Dr. Sultan is Professor of Finance, Bentley University. Now, respectfully over to you, Dr. Sultan.
Thank you, Devender, and a warm welcome to everyone. I'll be very brief. I want to just introduce the Boston Pledge to you. Some of you are already familiar with that. The Boston Pledge is a nonprofit organization that brings together outstanding professionals from many disciplines. We are committed to public service to directly address issues at the base of the pyramid. We offer entrepreneurship springboard program to locate, educate, and facilitate bottom-up enterprising. We hold annual conferences to raise consciousness on development issues. We're also engaged in several critical initiatives, including Model Village, Rural Innovation Center Enterprise, Leadership Development, and TBP Digital, especially to connect school students from privileged and underprivileged regions. Our approach is very simple. We listen to you in order to identify issues, and then we marshal our humble resources to provide solutions. Our strong conviction and belief is that by transcending the constraints of self-interest and limits of national borders, by providing outstanding leadership in channeling intellectual know-how and financial resources, and by focusing on uncovering the inner power within people at the grassroots, we will be able to create a more virtuous, progressive, and equitable and sustainable society. Please visit our website, thebostonpledge.org. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the brainchild and the chairman of the Boston Pledge, my friend, Mr. Partha Ghosh.
Thank you very much. We had a very good beginning today talking about problem solving in bringing together the hosts and the co-hosts. And that was an example of the dance that we went through to really set up the program this morning in Boston. Welcome to all of you. Greetings from Boston once again. The subject today is very, very close to my heart. As you know, I spent the last 40 years in the problem solving space, and yet I feel I've only touched the 1% and the 99% remains unknown, how to be a good problem solver. But that experiment with myself and the problems around the world, as many of you know, I had the privilege to serve corporates around the world and with different kinds of problems. Only thing that I've learned is the problem solving process is indeed a continuous search, a search for the truth, the search for the unknown, connecting the known with the unknown, and in the process creating the right kind of symphony. So I would like to set up, we have the brilliant speakers, which I'll introduce briefly towards after sharing with you a little bit of my personal understanding of what problem solving is all about. And then I would really look forward to listening to three, absolutely, I would say they're the best speakers that I could think of, who could talk about problems from solving from multiple dimensions. So I'm absolutely honored that we are here, but let me explore and expose my ignorance a little bit before we get started, so we can create the right kind of fabric, the right kind of background on which you can paint, and in the process, hopefully we'll become better problem solvers. And Dr. Chopra, also thank you for joining, because we are looking forward to your expert comments after you've heard the three world-class speakers, to particularly discuss how we could put the problem-solving experience that you'll hear of in the context of India, which perhaps a country which offers us the most difficult and complex problems of our times. Now, I'd like to share my screen. I put together a few slides to sort of go to the heart of what I want to discuss. And just 5 minutes that I will take to, I think we have to put, so yeah, I think we should put everyone on mute if we could do that, except the speaker. So I on purpose chose, and fortunately we experienced in the first 4 minutes between 9:28 Boston time and 9:34, the dance with the visible and invisible. It was not done on purpose, and clearly in the Twilight Zone. So I would like to basically set up my perspective on problem solving. And often I feel it is a search in the darkness, because any problem when unknown is basically we're venturing in the dark space with streaks of lights. And the challenge that we face is how to connect the streaks of lights with the lights that we cannot see or very far away. And in that spirit, I feel when we are in the darkness, when we close our eyes, we have the power to imagine, more so when we are in light. So it's very important to feel that we could make our being become relevant in the Twilight Zone, where you could on one side observe what you can see in the light, and at the same time imagine what you cannot see in the darkness. So that's why I chose a lot of problem solving is indeed connecting the known with the unknown. And in fact, I remember a line from Tagore, where first I'll tell you in Bengali, then I'll translate in English, because Bengali sounds beautifully. Janar mache ojanari korechi shandhan, means within the known, I have looked for the unknown. A lot of problem solving is indeed that how do we connect the known, which we can see, with the unknown, which we cannot see. And that's exactly what happened with Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, Boson, the Sutton-Bose, that they could see any of these. These are not observations that you could make. You imagine, then you apply the mathematics or the knowledge that you have to explore the unknown. So, and as you do so, we understand the visible with the invisible, and you start seeing the dance, that some parts are more visible, some parts are less visible, and some parts still remain invisible. And that's what I have learned in my problem solving experience. And in the process, new patterns starts emerging. Is it a triangle? Is it a square? And then of course, how do you connect the two? And this ability to look for patterns, look for several patterns, and then create the super pattern is what a lot of problem solving was all about. When you look at people like Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, Steve Jobs of the past, and that's what I think they did brilliantly. And they were able to put that into action to create what I would call the new patterns, the new models, what we call the new business models in management consulting terms. So this is the Twilight Zone, where I think is very, very important. And as for educators, it is particularly important that how could we help our students for leadership of companies, how could we help our executives literally travel to that twilight zone, which is not easy because we normally like to be in the zone where we are comfortable. But by twilight zone, I mean going to the boundary of what we know, which is where light is focused, versus where there's nothing known, it's absolutely dark. And that's where the darkness is extremely helpful, I think, to be able to imagine, because you can only imagine the darkness, what might be the possibilities, and then connect with the observations that we could make in the light zone. And this connectivity of imagination and observation is that what I'm looking forward to hearing from my very, very good friends, Jerry, Nav, and Peter, and I'll quickly introduce them. But as you do so, new patterns emerge, new solutions emerge, you see new perspective at the twilight zone, you see new shapes, and then you start making the connections. And in the process, your ability to make uncommon connections, which is another aspect, which is extremely important in problem solving. So one, to be in the twilight zone, to be able to look for new patterns, imagine some in the dark, observe very carefully what is lighted, and then being able to make uncommon connections, and in the process, interesting solutions emerge. So life is all about to be able to test patterns and connect patterns, and in the process, solutions emerge. And that's what you will see, whether you talk about business leaders, thought leaders, physicists, chemists, philosophers, that they have been able to do that with a lot of elegance. And the challenge is that how do we prepare our human mind to get to that space? And that's where I would like to kind of complete my discussion, that being focused on educators and education, I think one challenge I feel that we have to increasingly work on is helping people to develop the courage to reconfigure, rethink, reimagine possibilities. And unless we have that courage, it is extremely difficult to be the kind of problem solving that we are talking about. And the other dimension is the state of consciousness. That how do we elevate from where we are, where we feel comfortable, to being where, which is beyond our normal senses. So, you know, what I think Jerry's friend Peter Senge would talk about, the fifth discipline, but it could be the nth discipline, where you are exploring the unknown areas, and in the process you connect with the twilight zone. Then you see what is possible in the areas lighted. You imagine what you do not see in the dark areas. And in the process, you make the uncommon connections. You see new patterns. So to summarize, which I think we'll be learning from the speakers today, that on one side, how do we cultivate the courage and conscience of problem solving, and particularly help people move towards the twilight zone, which is on the boundaries of where you feel comfortable and uncomfortable. And in the process, imagine colorful possibilities, and hopefully new solutions would emerge. So that's how I would summarize my humble perspective of what problem solving is all about. And it purely reflects some of my experience over the last 30, 40 years across boundaries. But clearly, it is a continuous process of search. I would say that with the highest amount of humility, that no one ever would believe that I have become the perfect problem solver. In McKinsey, when I started, we wrote a book, In Search of Excellence. I think problem solving is similar. It is a search. It's a continuous search process in seeking for the better solutions. And we never know enough. There's always a new frontier. And more we know, the darkness around us only increases, because the circumference of what we know increases. So the darkness around it obviously increases. So with that, I would like to introduce the stars of today. All of them are very, very good friends of mine. I'll go in the order in which I've known them, because all of them are equally important. So please excuse me If I'm discussing someone first versus someone last, all of you are very, very important to me. Now, Dr. Jerry Brightman and I met about 12 years ago in the floors of Tufts University. And as I got to know him, you will see a man who brings literally multiple dimensions of thinking. He has spent years, almost 40 years, basically uncovering the leadership in personalities across the world. I know whenever I look for him, he would answer me back from Brazil or from Russia or from China. So he's man on the go. Basically, I would not use the word teaching leadership, but discussing leadership. You cannot teach leadership, you can cultivate leadership. And he is my colleague at the Tufts University, also teaches at Harvard. But more importantly, he's a man who could make any dull moment very cheerful. So I'm really looking forward to the cheerfulness, and he will going to be discussing with us the effective problem solving using systems thinking, looking backwards to look forward. And he's a very, very good friend of another good friend of mine, Partha S Ghosh, who was a colleague of mine when I was at MIT, but then he became a star when he wrote his first book, The Fifth Discipline. Then, of course, so I've known Jerry for 12 years. I've known Dr. Navjot Singh, but I call him Nav. Nav is, of course, we are coming from the same pedigree as a senior partner in McKinsey and Company and a managing director of the Boston office. You could see part of his problem-solving capability this morning at 9:29 to 9:31 when he really helped us to get out of the logjam that we were in. But more importantly, Nav and I have known each other for the last 18 years. And I've been every time impressed on one side with his, again, cheerfulness. On the other side, the depth of thinking he brings to play. As you could see, he's the owner of 15 plus patent. 15 plus could mean 150 also. I don't know how many patents he has got, but that's a very rare achievement within the McKinsey world. And as you could see, he literally brings along a lot of disciplines of thinking, medicine, science, and he works for both governments and business. So once again, welcome, Nav. And finally, someone whom I met long time ago, and I'm very proud to be his friend. I met Peter in Düsseldorf in McKinsey. I don't know whether, Peter, you remember that, but I remember. It was Düsseldorf. We were having an automotive practice meeting, and I just became a partner that time. And I think it was 1983. And I was very impressed that time. I don't know whether, Peter, you remember, with the kind of questions you would ask with a mysterious touch. And since then, Peter has become a good friend. We have been together in Bali. We have been there in Japan, in many parts of the world where we want to go. He has invited me to join him in Tibet, in India, in Ladakh, in Mongolia, in Germany, in Russia. And he has literally lived the world and speaks multiple languages. But what is interesting for Peter, he's one of those few individuals, we talk about the term Renaissance, who has been the Renaissance man, who has been able to connect all kinds of dots. So Peter would be talking about creative tension, the mentor's little helper to developing problem-solving capability. What a beautiful title. And I'm really looking forward to the romance of this title, as we'll be dancing with the mentor and the helper and the mentee. But it is all about dance. So with that introduction, Jerry, let me have the privilege to invite you in as the first speaker, where you'll be talking about effective problem solving using systems thinking, looking backward as we look forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Partha. I'm very honored to be in this mix of speakers here. I feel very humbled by your expertise, and hope that I can add something to this beautiful conference. I want to first begin with something that was unprepared, reflecting on what Partha said earlier about making the invisible visible. And it goes back to a wonderful TED Talk by Sir Kenneth Robinson, who was talking about creativity and the schools. And he tells the story of a young girl, maybe 6 years old, in a drawing class, drawing away like crazy. And the teacher comes over, looks over her shoulders, can't truly understand what she's drawing. And he asks her, sweetheart, what are you drawing? And she looks up at him and says, I am drawing a picture of God. And the teacher says, well, dear, you know that nobody has seen God yet before. And with all the enthusiasm in the world, she turns to him and says, they will in a minute. Because she had the imagination and the foresight to understand things that were invisible that he just couldn't see. And so that's why I think I love teaching with younger people, maybe not so young, but younger, in the range probably of 28 to 32. And I love this notion of problem solving and systems thinking. So I'm going to begin with a scene that was about a year or so ago. And I was talking with my colleagues at Tufts, where we always would go over our classes from the year before and see if we could make them better. And we looked at the critiques and the feedback from our students, and there were several last year who said something about the resources that we were providing to them via books or websites and so forth. And someone used the word that they weren't current enough. They were not current enough. And some of my colleagues reacted and said, we must make them more current. And of course, as Partha said, I had to play the devil's advocate and say, this really bothers me. Because as we all know, some pieces of work that were written 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, and I'm not even including the Bible, were pretty well written. And should, we're not going to dismiss them for the critique that someone wants something that's more current. So this bothered me, and I look back at some of the things that we had recommended. And one was a very famous article by John Kotter, one of the leadership gurus in the world, about what leaders really do. And it was a seminal article in the Harvard Business Review over 30 years ago. And I wouldn't change a word in that. And it's beautiful. So current or not current, that's a must read. And as Partha will agree with me, and he's heard me say this millions of times, a lot of the books on leadership are not worth the paper that they're written on. There's probably, if we're lucky, 3 or 4% of those books and articles and so I try to get through the wheat and the chaff to get to the heart of these readings for our students. Another book, Peter Senge's book, The Art and Practice of the Fifth Discipline, The Art and Practice of the Learning Organization, wasn't even out until the start of the century. So that's already 20 years old. To me, it seems like it's as current as this morning. I'm on my second or third copy because I dog-eared so many pages, made so many notes in the margins, and I can't think of anything that would compare to that in terms of leadership and systems thinking. So this led to my idea that we should really pay attention to the past as we try to understand the future. And so one example for me is this idea of systems thinking, or what Peter Senge calls the fifth discipline. And the nifty thing about the fifth discipline, as opposed to other books like the seven Habits of Successful People, in Covey's book, there's 7 habits, and they're kind of, because of the title, we all look at them as being somewhat equal, right? Senge's book is called The Fifth Discipline, so we know that there are 5, but one seems to be a little bit more important or different than the other 4, and it's because in problem solving, we work into systems thinking the other 4 disciplines, which are really self-awareness, really getting to know ourselves. And I start every class with the humility that I see this morning by saying nobody in this classroom is as self-aware as we need to be, including your esteemed professor. Now, part of that might be that I'm married to a psychologist, so I wake up in the morning and I say, "Good morning, sweetheart," and she says, "What do you mean by that?" So already I know that I'm in deep trouble. So another of the disciplines that are wrapped into systems thinking is creating a shared vision. And when we try to problem solve, we should have an idea of where we're heading, and we should have maybe a metaphor to help us. Partha's metaphor is wonderful. I've not heard that before. And the other speakers, I'm sure, will present theirs. So I admit that I love, the other disciplines, excuse me, team learning. how do we learn as a team? There's a lot of work done on building teams and working in teams, but there's the book now, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni has been a bestseller for the last 5 or 10 years, and I predict will continue to be the last in the next 5 or 10 years, because our teams don't know how to learn together. And then lastly, and a very important element in systems thinking and in problem solving are these insidious mental models, the way we think, the way we view the world. And that's why I love the topic of this speech, because problem solving, if we think about it, when did we begin to solve problems? We were very, very small. Our parents gave us toys, or we had to manipulate going through the transition of crawling to walking. And we developed habits at that very early age that are still with us today. So the reason that I mentioned systems thinking is not to shift your thinking from where it was to what I'm talking about, but it's to provide an alternative, another tool in your leadership toolkit to think differently. And I want to, you're all quoting nifty people, wonderful people. I'm going to choose one too. Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein said once, "We cannot solve the problems we face today with the same level of thinking that existed when the problem began." Now think about that. Is he saying to throw out our old thinking? No, but he's saying there's got to be alternative ways because the world is changing. And if he said this quote maybe 20 years ago, guess what? The world is changing significantly faster today and will change even significantly faster tomorrow. So we need to catch up to improve our level of thinking to meet these old problems. So I admit I love systems thinking, especially as it relates to problem solving. Systems thinking really directs itself to solving these more complex and what I call chronic problems. And by a chronic problem, I mean a problem that has existed for a while. We think we've solved it. And then for some reason, 6 months later, it rears its ugly head and we have to solve it again. So it's not really fully solved. So Partha told me there are a lot of educators in the audience. And what I'd like to share with them is a little bit of pedagogy of how I begin the discussion of systems thinking. And so I introduced them first through the metaphor of an iceberg. So if you can all use your imagination, which Partha has already gotten us into outer space, I'm going to bring you back down to earth, but I want you to envision, if you will, an iceberg. And the very tip of that iceberg, the behavior of all business people and other people around the world, at the very tip of that iceberg is what we call event behavior. And event behavior is really problem solving. And so when I have my classes, I ask them, how many of you spend most of your day at work? And invariably the answer comes back, problem solving. I said, well, that's good. Firefighting, well, that's good. And how much time do you spend problem solving and firefighting? And believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, the answer is somewhere about 89 to 94%. So I then look at the class and they look at my face and they can see I'm irritated somehow, and they're wondering why I'm irritated. And the answer is, so I look at them and I do this purposefully as an educator because I want to get them riled up a little bit. And I say, so let me ask you a question. This means that if I have a picture of you in your office, you're doing nothing but twiddling your thumbs, maybe playing with your iPhone, waiting for a problem to show itself, and then you can leap into action and solve the problem. And you do this 94% of the time. Yes. And firefighting. There's a very interesting quote by a friend of mine who once said, beware of firefighters, it creates arsonists. Can you believe that? I mean, that's true. But these people love this. And I said, okay, let me ask you now a tougher question. Solving problems the way you're talking about this, is this reactive or proactive? And we all know the answer. It's reactive. We have to wait for the problem to exist before we can solve it. We have to wait for the fire to exist before we can extinguish it. The next level on this metaphor is right at the surface of the water, where the water meets the iceberg. And we call this area of behavior patterns over time, right? And so I use an example and I say, what if as a manufacturing company, we were always short of our widgets that we make in October, November, and December. And the last 5 years, our marketing data has shown we've been remiss. We're short of our product that we could sell in October, November, December, but we just don't have product. And so what should we do? And in year 6, we make the brilliant decision we should make more in January, February, and March to meet that October, November, December deficit. So I then asked my class, let me ask you a question. Is this proactive or reactive? And it's very interesting as an educator in this moment because there's some uncertainty. Some people will raise their hand and say that's very proactive. We thought ahead and we made more in January, February, and March, and we're going to meet that demand. Others would say reactive, because who's to say the marketing data for that 5 years is going to be the same as it in year 6. And if you think back to the first oil crisis, right? If I was a manager of a fleet of 500 trucks, and I was going to be very clever in my future forecast and increase and predict an increase in the price of oil for my trucks or gasoline for my trucks from maybe $1 to $1.25, 25 cents, 25% increase. That's terrific. What's going to happen when the price of gasoline hits $5? I'm going to be fired, right? So again, this is reactive. So if we add the event behavior with the patterns and trends behavior, 98% of the people in the world today, as even brilliant leaders, are spending their time doing reactive things. This is crazy. And here's where systems thinking comes. Because what part of the iceberg have I not mentioned? I have not mentioned that part of the iceberg which is beneath the water, which is 90% of the iceberg. And we call this the structural level, right? And by structure, I mean a million things, like how do we hire people? How do we fire people? How do we promote people? How do we create a vision for the future? And also embedded in this structure underneath the water of this iceberg are these insidious, what Senge calls mental models, which, and by insidious, I mean, Senge says all of our mental models are inherently flawed, and our job as leaders is to make them less flawed. So regrettably, a lot of our leaders and people in business today think that those policies and procedures were written by this 6-year-old who I referenced early in this talk, by God. But these are not made by God. They're made by people, and they can be changed by people. So at the structural level, guess what? This is the area that's totally proactive. And this is where the leader lives. Okay? And this is where problem solving should take place. Now, I'm going to go back and apologize to those managers who probably live in the event level and the patterns level, because they're doing the work that they should be doing. And this is what managers love. And managers deal with the complexity of change that's given to them by their leaders. But the leader lives in the structural level where he or she is changing the structure for the better of the future. Going back to the Einstein quote, they're seeing the changes. You know, this was not in my talk, but I want to mention recently there was a wonderful report by the Center for Creative Leadership, which says the days are gone when we can go to our HR professionals and ask what's the next stage of our leadership and problem-solving development. If those days are gone, I can't help you. You're on your own. And my thought about that as an educator is, okay, now you're putting this burden on my shoulder, and how do I know what I don't know? How do I know what's in Partha's head, or what's at Jahangir's head, or Jerry's head that's going to help me here? And they're stuck. So one answer for me is this idea of systems thinking and looking at the structure of an organization to create problems more effectively. Now, the reason that I think I really love systems thinking is because of what's called systems thinking archetypes. And archetypes are common stories that can relate to any type of business, pharmaceutical, medical, trucks, or any country in the world, whether it be India, the United States, France, or the People's Republic of China. Doesn't matter. So that's why they're called archetypes, a common story. So as an educator, my pedagogy to get my students interested in this is to present a scenario that they all know. And that scenario is called starvation in Somalia. And I pick on Somalia, I don't know why, but I have. It doesn't matter, it could be starvation anywhere. And I ask people to pretend they're watching CNN. And now as Wolf Blitzer of CNN, who we all know probably, he interrupts his broadcast to say, we're going to bring to you a picture of a very serious situation in Somalia. And the picture on our television screen goes to this desolate area of Somalia. And what do we see? We see horror, right? We see emaciated bodies. We see distended stomachs. We feel terrible. And the reporter is telling us, yes, this is terrible. This drought, this starvation has been going on for quite a while. And now the world is going to be introduced to this. That's day one. The next day we turn on CNN and the story is still the top story on CNN, but it's different. Men in suits, women in suits are in front of microphones saying, we cannot allow this condition to stand. We are going to send in excess food from our country to help those poor people in Somalia. Day three, we turn on CNN, and now the situation and the picture changes yet again. Planes are flying into Somalia. They are distributing food. And we see people who maybe we thought were dead 3 days ago in the initial picture are alive and they're receiving food. And how do we feel? We shift from feeling terrible 3 days ago to feeling wonderful that the food arrives. And we feel very good. That person we thought was dead or dying is alive, they're eating, and they feel terrific. And then we turn on CNN the next day on day 4, and what do we see? And the answer is, of course, I ask my students this, and so there's more of a pause than I'm making here, but for the purpose of the speech, what do we see on day 4? The answer is nothing. Problem solved, done, complete. There's nothing, and we talk about the events of the world that day. However, smart people know that this problem has not been solved, right? And they're not surprised when 6 months later, they see the situation on TV again. You all have heard this story. Change the name of the country, change the name of the condition, but these chronic issues have a way of raising their ugly head 5, 6 months after we think the problem is solved. So if you have a pen or a pencil, this is called the audience participation part of the speech, right? I'm a good teacher. I don't want to do all the work. I'm going to have you do some work. So on your piece of paper, here's what I want you to do. I want you to make 3 equal-sized rectangles on the left side of the paper, right? Pretend there's a line in the middle, and 1, 2, 3, put 3 boxes, empty boxes, equal-sized, one on the top, one in the middle, and one on the bottom. Now, I want you to add 1 more box on the right side of the paper, equidistant to the middle box on the left. So you have three boxes on the left, 3 boxes on the right. I'm sorry, 1 box on the right, equidistant to the middle box. Now, I'm going to tell that CNN story, but in systems thinking terms. The middle box on the left, we're going to call that problem symptom. Problem symptom. And in 3 words or less. So we're not going to try to make this, something that's unimaginable. We're going to make it pretty simple. And I have my students do this, but I'm going to do this for us in this talk. So very simply, we could put down the word starvation, right? That works, 1 word. And we call that the problem symptom. Up above in the next box, we call this quick fix. Quick fix. And again, this box is easy to fill out because we say send in the food. So here's the problem, starvation, quick fix, send in the food. Now, on the far right, that lone box over there is called unintended consequences. Unintended consequences. So now think for a moment. We've just done this wonderful humanitarian act. We've brought food from all over the world to this poor country. How could there possibly be unintended consequences? And this is why I want to really stress systems thinking as an alternative to the habitual ways we've found in the past to solve problems, because it allows us to think outside the box and into Partha's universe, right? So what's the invisible? What don't we see that we can now make very present in the visible space? And the answer is simple. And I'm just going to give you a couple. And you know the answers to this. Number one, the dependency on outside forces to bring in the food. So where is the incentive by the government or anybody else to enhance food production in the country? Secondly, what if you're a farmer? This is the third or fourth time this situation has happened. The hell with it. I'm going to go work in the city with my uncles and aunts and sisters and brothers who have left the farms, and I'm going to make some money there because I can't make it through farming. So what happens? The drought next time, the starvation the next time, we have fewer farmers, even less food, right? What happens to the price of food? And I ask this question to my students, and they always say the price goes up. No, the price goes down because the food is being brought in for free. There's no price of food. So there's no incentive to grow food. We could go on and on with all the unintended consequences, which right off the bat blows my mind, because here we've done this beautiful humanitarian act, and you're telling me all the reasons that this problem solving did not work. But here's the key to all of this, and the fourth box is the one that's on the far left at the bottom, and we call this fundamental choices. And everyone in this room listening to this talk, you know the answers. And none of you may be agronomists or agriculturists, but you know the answers. And the answers could range from finding a better, sophisticated irrigation system. Find seeds that are that combat the insects and the flies, right? We could maybe bring in wonderful retired farmers from India, from Israel, from the United States to help the farmers. And guess what? In our deep thinking, we could also say, and I'm going to sound controversial here, and I don't mean to, let them die, because maybe this is the wrong place to be growing food. Now, here's where we bring in self-awareness and our value system. Of course, we're not going to let them die, but maybe they should move farming to a different place. So now you see the same CNN story illustrated in the archetype, and it happens to be called Shifting the Burden, but it's a common story. And using this way of problem solving is a wonderful alternative for bringing up a lot more ideas. It's different than brainstorming. And the beautiful work about this archetype that I've just presented to you is as follows. The quick fix in this story was bringing in the food. And I don't mean to say that this was bad. The quick fit, and what we've learned from this archetype over time, and this is what I've been taught by Peter Senge and others, is the quick fix, if in service of the fundamental choice, is a good thing, right? Because we've brought in food, we've saved lives, while we're trying to find a more sophisticated irrigation system, better seeds, better farmers, retired farmers, and so forth. But the corollary to this, which is the shadow side of this, which gets us all in trouble, is the quick fix without attention to the fundamental choice atrophies the potential for any one of us to make that fundamental choice. And regrettably, in the world we're in today, which is so fast, so furious, so complex, that we're just looking at our to-do list, trying to check off everything today without paying consideration to tomorrow, and without looking at those invisible areas of the universe that Partha was talking about. So in order to prepare ourselves for this and I'm not asking you to change your habits. I've said this before. I don't want anyone to change their problem-solving habits because they've obviously worked. Here's another tool for your toolkit, is to embrace the notion of systems thinking. But in order to do that, you have to envelop the other disciplines that Senge talks about. We have to know ourselves well, and we don't know ourselves as well as we could. So we have to be more self-aware as leaders, which is the fundamental foundation upon which leadership lives. And we have to shoot for more personal mastery to truly know ourselves. Number two, we need a shared vision to solve problems. We can't do this willy-nilly. We all have to be on board. I was very, very lucky years ago to be part of the first American company that went to the People's Republic of China. And we had the strangest vision of all times, and it worked. Visions work. Our vision was to walk hand in hand with the Chinese people into the 21st century. And guess what? That was not a very popular vision. Many people in my Boston office said, what the hell? I'm not going to hop on a plane for 2 days, go to China, be jet lagged, do my work, come back home in 2 days and be jet lagged out. I'm not going to go. For me, as a young guy, I was ecstatic. I couldn't wait to hop on my first trip to China and the 27 trips that came afterwards, and the most important trip when I adopted my little girl from China. So it's not what the vision is, it's what the vision does. It's not what the vision is, it's what the vision does. And for me and my colleagues who went to China 27 times, over a 10-year period, we did $1 billion of two-way trade. $1 billion, not bad for a little $50 million company. And it was because of what this vision did. Thirdly, we need to learn better in teams. We don't do teams well. And the future of this planet and business is all going to be in teams. So we got to get smarter and learn how to learn, right? And learn together in teams. Lencioni's book is a good place to start, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I don't need to tout his book. He's rich enough. He's probably made a fortune. It's been a bestseller for the last 5 years or so. It will be a bestseller for the next 5 or 10 years. So again, going back for me, this pedagogy that I've used, I know has gotten my students started in terms of thinking more systemically. And I've had some wonderful success stories. One of my students at Harvard last year was a PhD student in law, in strategic negotiations. At the end of the class, he came to me, he said, Jerry, while I've been taking this class here at Harvard for 7 weeks, I've written a paper that's been accepted. It's going to go all throughout Germany. It's linking systems thinking to strategic thinking and negotiation. And I was thrilled as an educator. He took what we threw out at him and he used it and he thought about it and he brought it to his own work. As a teacher, you all know it's not really the money, but when you get a student like that, you're on top of the world. So in the end, I urge my students and my clients in my professional work to use systems thinking as an additional tool in their leadership toolkit to make themselves better leaders. Regrettably, I also have to point out the shadow side of systems thinking and its adoption in the world. It is kind of like the quality movement that came to the United States through Dr. Deming. Dr. Deming was abused in the United States and he left for Japan, where the Japanese automakers said, boy, this is brilliant stuff and we're going to make the best cars in the world, which they did. Then everyone in the United States said we should learn quality. And they tried to, and they grabbed that low-hanging fruit, and then the quality movement kind of disappeared. And regrettably, I have to say, because I know my colleagues who are brilliant in this area are so disappointed that not more people take up systems thinking as a discipline to help them in their problem-solving world. So in closing, I just want to add, this is an alternative. We've got habits that go back to when we were 4 or 5, 6 years ago, 4 or 5 years of age. And these habits are hard to break. But as Einstein said, we can't solve the problems of today with the same level of thinking that existed when the problem began. So we've got to change our thinking. So like Partha wants us to be astronauts and go out into the outer atmosphere and see those invisible spaces, I urge you to consider systems thinking as a unique way of problem solving that solves problems so they stay solved. Thank you all very much. It was a pleasure to be part of this gathering.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. Thank you very much indeed. And obviously we have learned a lot. And it's a culture of systems thinking, which is what we have to cultivate, the culture of thinking broad and connecting the dots. But again, systems continuously expand and they evolve. Now, let me have the privilege to invite no other than my friend, Dr. Navjot Singh. I already introduced him, but I love the title. It's Instigating 0 to 1, the excitement and dilemma of disruption. And more, I'm looking forward to the excitement and the enlightenment. With that, I'll pass it on to Dr. Navjot Singh. Nav, all yours.
Thank you, Partha. And I intentionally chose my topic to be 0 to 1. And I think just to set the context, It's difficult to go from 0 to 1. It's equally difficult to go from 1 to 10. It's equally difficult to go from 10 to 100. You need problem solving in all three of those categories, but you need different types of problem solving. And my thesis is it's all about people, and it's all about instigation. If you can instigate enough people to think big, Partha, in your words, be at that interface, be at that boundary. I love, like Jerry's talk right now. I mean, it's more about being able to look under the iceberg and thinking about what people have not thought about. That is where most of our time should be spent. But I would also argue that our GDP is run 99% by 1 to hundreds. 0 to 1 are the ones who instigate the future. So I'm going to focus my discussion more on how to instigate the 0 to 1. And I'll share some concrete ideas and thoughts. This is not going to be a McKinsey presentation, so that there'll be no slides. In fact, I intentionally have no data. There are plenty of reports that we publish. You can look at all of them. There are a lot of things that we can talk about, but it's going to be some of my perspectives on how to think about this problem. So like Partha, I was very impressed with the discussion last week. I think like kudos to the whole Boston Pledge team on what you all have been doing. I am a product of the education system in India and the US. Let's be, and I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful to all my teachers and the system that I grew up in. We all know systems are not perfect. They can never be. But for a person like me, they worked. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I know it didn't work for many, right? But it did work for me, and I'm thankful for that. But I would also say that we spend most of our time at home when we're growing up. And my parents had a huge role to play in there also. My mom used to be a school teacher. My dad, who passed away 6 weeks ago, was the biggest cheerleader I had. And I always had a constant encouragement at home. So it is both what you learn at school and what happens to you at home that counts. So as I go into this topic, I just wanted to ensure you I'm not going to talk about Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. That is not what I'm here about. I'm talking about more from my own experiences and from my heart and also share some ideas and some concrete ideas. We can all talk about the problem. I would rather begin to problem solve on some of the solutions. And I think I'm going to share some ideas and thoughts on what one could do. Let me start off with a story. I was invited to a panel, and the panel's topic was, is innovation dead? This was almost like 7 years ago. And my panelists were arguing that we've not been creative enough, we're not thinking about the big issues, we're not thinking about all what could happen. Most of the innovation is happening, but it's incremental, it is not big. And my argument was innovation is not dead, but thriving and accelerating. So I decided at the spur of the moment to do an experiment. I asked a crowd of 120 people in the audience. I've never done this before. I said, how many of you have thought of a bold idea in the last hour? A few hands went up. Last 24 hours, a few plus a few more hands went up. Last 1 week, last 1 month, last 1 year. At the end of the exercise, only 10 people of the 120 had raised their hands. I was surprised by that because and my wife teases me on that because every time I go into a shop, I have a new idea. And I was quite sad by that because I think my conclusion from that, which I demonstrated to the whole group, is I'm not sure if innovation is dead, but mass imagination is. And Jerry, this goes back to your iceberg point that there's a lot happening below the surface that people are not imagining. And part of what you just described, right? People are not imagining what is possible. And I think we need to get the imagination going before we can get innovation going. Now, talking about innovation, what an exciting time we're living in, right? I mean, if you look at all around the world, I feel blessed having seen no computers to now and no like mobile to now in this world where we have mobile, we have got AI, we've got cancer care that's advancing by the day, we've got batteries that has become the latest rage, electric cars, self-driven cars, space travel. All of this would be science fiction, right? I mean, we could have easily written science fiction on this, and we're truly living in a very, very exciting time. But these innovations require big ideas, and big ideas require big dreams. And a big idea that starts at 0 may not become 1. The 1 may not become 10. The 1 may not become 100. And that is the dilemma, because if you had a guarantee that your 0 to 1 idea will become 100, it's no brainer. Many more people will do it. The issue is most will not. Big ideas are exciting, they're inspiring, they are fun to brainstorm, they are energizing, they're entertaining, and it's also exciting. And I think that is why I say living the 0 to 1 FUD is fun. But at the same time, they're often viewed as crazy. Big idea thinkers are described as nuts. They are often viewed as impractical. They are because the ideas are known to have, it's unclear what are the outcomes they're going to have. They are viewed to be too aspirational. Big idea people are dreamers who are not practical, who can't hit the milestones, who can't get things done. Trust me, I've lived in both the worlds. And that is how a 0 to 1 thinker feels at times. So the question for me is, how do you instigate just enough 0 to 1s? Because if everybody was instigating 0 to 1, that'll be a big problem. The question is how to instigate just enough 0 to 1s. Because dreams ultimately do become real, and there's no innovation without imagination. And that is a problem-solving angle I would like to focus on, as to how do you instigate more 0 to 1. Now, we can all sit and complain that this is not happening, that is not happening, people are not thinking about this, they're not doing this. But what are the tangible things people across the ecosystem can do to address this issue? So I think one needs to look at the whole ecosystem. You look at what like companies can do, what higher ed institutions can do, what K through 12 teachers can do, because that is the most influenceable age. What can governments do? What can parents do? And what I, as a person, can do. So let me go through each of them and share some ideas and thoughts that might or may not, that may or may not resonate for you. So on the companies, as a 0 to 1 thinker, my humble view would be recognize the 0 to 1s around you. Identify them, celebrate them. They don't need problem-solving help. They just need the nurturing. They are a rare breed. They can shape your future. They need to be nurtured. Take care of them. And on take care of them, that is idea number 2. I think we all have learned about unconscious bias in the context of discrimination. I would argue there is an unconscious bias against 0 to 1 also. They're often viewed as crazy, impractical, bold ideas that will not go anywhere. Trust me, I've gone through this. Luckily, it made me stronger. It is not the case for everyone. We need to take care of the 0 to 1 thinkers in our companies. We need to challenge them, ask them for advice, give them the freedom. I often say in our office, there's a 90% chance I will not say no. So go do things. Don't even ask. I'd be surprised. Very few people choose to do it. Very few people choose to do it. And in many ways, I'm glad, because otherwise, if everybody was doing it, that'd be a big issue. And I'm glad they don't. So it's a calculated bet. But most people are not 0 to 1. We need to encourage most of them. And when we find them, take care of them. And also in recruiting. Partha, you are used to our McKinsey case interviews. I do the McKinsey case, but I also insert in a few other things also. I throw in a curveball. I throw in, say, look, if I give you this, what would you do? And some of them think well through it, and some of them don't. So one needs to think through how do you recruit people as you're looking for the 0 to 1 thinkers also. So that was about companies. Now let's go into what can higher ed institutions do. If you look at the higher ed institutions, I would argue that, especially in the STEM fields, because STEM is a big part of it, or at least that is what I grew up with, and I think like many of you have also grown up with like STEM, and there could be others. To me, we are still teaching people in a classic way. We are talking about analytical problem solving. We're talking about equations, formula, algebra, mechanics, engineering, modeling. Are we teaching enough conceptual problem solving? Are we challenging them enough, Jerry, to your point about what is below the iceberg? Imagine what is there. Are we teaching those tricks? Do we have enough papers that challenge people to write science fiction and just not the science? So it is more about the conceptual problem solving. Number 2 is, why are the engineering and the sciences, we are so focused on publications? I mean, I did not go into academia because I didn't want to publish things that do not lead to impact right away. I mean, they're awesome. They're great training grounds, but I do want to invent. And why are the faculty not incented enough to invent also? There's no doubt that publications are an important part. That is where you can get things out. But why are we not incenting people enough to invent? And then once you invent, it becomes the issue: who has the IP? Is this my IP? Is this company's IP? All those like battles go on. We need to make the whole system much easier so that people are inventing, and when they invent, you train the students to invent also. Because if you train students to publish only, that is what you get. If you train the students to invent, that is what you will get. So if you want more like 0 to 1, being able to move from publications to like patenting becomes a critical point. And that brings me to the faculty hiring and the curriculum. Jerry, I would love to debate you one of these days as to how to think about this, because I serve some of the higher institutions also, and I'm on the advisory board of one of them also. And my fear is that when the young kids come and say, we want to learn newer things, because I sometimes go back and say that people are still teaching from the same books, to your point. Some of those books are classics, and that's totally fine. But we are not changing the curriculum. If we are truly in the innovation world, 10% of the curriculum every year should be new, or 5%. So over the 20-year period, you can have some turnover, right? And I was shocked at times that sometimes people are not even learning how to code. In this world that we're living in, students not getting the opportunity to learn how to code, in my mind, is pretty sad. On one hand, you would say that high school should teach them, but not every high school teaches that also. So some of the engineering schools not teaching coding in a big way in the world we are living in is pretty sad, because you can't live at this interface and drive all these innovations if you're not arming the students with the right tools. Now let's go to the K through 12 teachers. Jerry, I loved your point about the picture, or was it Partha, with the picture of God, right? I mean, the kids don't know what is real and what is not. They need to, and teachers, in my mind, have a beautiful responsibility to shape the future of 0 to 1. They need to recognize that the kids are creative, they are not constrained, and nurture the 0 to 1. This is where I think I would say that, look, the kids don't think about gravity. They don't know what gravity is. They think kids can fly. That is why they like fairy tales. They love to dream, and they believe all of that. They can draw the picture of God. They are 1 second away from that, right? So and I would say teachers and educators have a responsibility to nurture that, because I would argue that younger students and kids, the imagination is much more. But when we come into the real life, when we begin to live in the world of 10 to 100, that imagination gets beaten out of us. And how do you nurture enough of that so that never goes away? Second, we're living in the world of testing, COVID-19 testing. Forget about the COVID-19 testing. I would argue you become what outcomes you're trying to drive. What is our testing? What is our testing doing? Is our testing nurturing enough of the 0 to 1s, or even 1 to 10s? Is the testing giving us enough problems to be tested on that the answers are not black and white, that force us to think, that force us to imagine? So we need to really think hard about the testing. And that goes to the teacher-led training. How do you train the teachers? How to train the faculty? And of course, they're brilliant. I mean, I'm a led product of a few, and I think I'm thankful and gracious to all of them. But as you think going forward, what is the curriculum that needs to be refined for the teachers also, so they become more 0 to 1 thinkers? So I think that is what, in my mind, K through 12 we should think about. Governments, what can governments do? I think governments need to send a message that they want to innovate themselves all the time. I would say governments are behind most of the big disruptions. And you look at governments all around the world, with data like spend, they have done amazing things. And governments are a big change in driving disruption. But why are they not trying to disrupt themselves all the time? Just like a company would say, look, I'm going to spend 5 to 10% or 2 to 3% of my spend on R&D. Why are governments not saying we're going to spend 1 to 3% on disrupting ourselves? Why should we be required? Why can't we have a completely different citizen experience? And that sends a message out. That sends a message out to the community, to society, that if we as governments are trying to change, it makes them nimble, it makes them fun, it makes them exciting, but it also sends a message out. Next is, why can't government announce some X prizes, encourage the 0 to 1 thinkers, get them going, pose some problems, pose some of the proactive problems, Jerry, that nobody has thought about, right? There's no reason that because people like to do constraint problem solving. They like to know, here's a problem I want to solve, I can solve it. Maybe we just need to instigate more problems. We just need to tell people, here are 5 problems to solve. Maybe they're very good at 1 to 100. They're not good at 0 to 1. Let's pose a lot of problems to them and have them think about it. And that way, you're not asking people to do what they're not good at. You're asking them to do what they're good at, that is solve problems. They don't know what problem to solve, and you pose the right problems to them. And then I would go back to the patent side, that I would say a robust IP regime. If you want 0 to 1 thinkers, you need to give them the incentive that if they invent, their patents will be respected, and you can make tons of money because that also helps, right? Because that is an incentive for people, or you can help the society in massive ways. But I'm just not leaving it for everybody else. As parents, our kids spend most of our time with us. Most of our time is with us. And if they're not 0 to 1 thinkers, the problem is ours. And we need to take responsibility for that. We just can't say, oh my goodness, their K through 12 school is not teaching. Oh, they went to the higher institution, they're not teaching it. The responsibility has to be ours. So with my son, for example, and I've got 2 boys, and they are two different curves. One of them is more like creative and thinks out of the box. We used to have a book of ideas. So at age 8, I would give them a problem. I said, okay, Neil, we have a gun violence issue. What would you do? And he came up with this idea that, look, Daddy, I'll have this thing in the jacket, which will have a spring, and a spring will pop out, grab the gun, and bring it back. Feasible? 0. Creative? Yes. Impossible? Yes. But it got him thinking. Engaged on the problem. And we had this book of ideas, which we ran for a bit, and then he's doing the things now. But they need to be given real life problems to solve. Jerry, because under the iceberg problems, people don't know what they are. You just need to give it to them at times. And there's no reason the system, there are enough people in the system who know what those issues are. And we'll also say we can learn from them. I mean, the kids offer an amazing opportunity to learn. They're not constrained by the laws of thermodynamics. They're not constrained by Newton's laws. They're not constrained by gravity. They dream, and we need to learn to dream. And that brings me to, what can I do? What can I do? I would say dream big. What stops you from dreaming? I mean, take a pen and begin to get your idea book out. All of us. Think about big ideas all the time. Fine, 99% of them will be junk. But the 1% or 0.1% could be the one. And I think we should all begin to dream. I would say, look for the 0 to 1s around you. Celebrate them. I would say, hang with the right 0 to 1s. Partha, I'm not sure if you've been to my home, but we host these Imagine get-togethers, where we convene people on a cool topic. We don't invite CEOs. We don't invite CEOs. We don't invite CPOs or CFOs or the chief commercial officers. We invite chief cool officers. And we say, look, we're going to pick a cool topic. We're going to invite the chief cool officers. And you know what? 100 people show up. If you invite anybody to say, I'm going to invite you to a gathering of chief cool officer, everybody thinks they're cool and they come. Right? So, and it is a beautiful debate and conversation. We've done 12 of these now, from the future of space exploration to synthetic biology. And people say, now, why are you doing this? I said, I don't know, but I like to hang around with people. And it is really amazing. The connectivity that you can build is really cool. We are not like convening an early stage investor conference. We've done 4 of these. We said, look, we cannot serve the smaller pre-series companies, but why can't we help them? By the way, in the process of helping them, we learn. We learn what the big 0 to 1 ideas are. So we have been doing it now. And last time we had 170 companies apply for it. And this year's is going to be in a few months. And we're hoping that more will come. But we want to be the conveners. And this is why I would say, what can I do is an equally important part of the problem. I was talking to my son this morning that I'm going to give this speech. And I said, Daddy, I'll tell them to make sure they don't blame anybody else. They can start. And he has a very powerful point. 7 billion people doing this can fix the issue. Everybody needs to dream. So now you will see, I didn't talk about it, and this is where I'm going to close. I did not talk about funding, because my thesis is, if there's a big idea, funding comes, and smart 0 to 1 thinkers will find the funding. There is enough in the ecosystem. There's capital chasing great ideas. That is not an issue. I didn't talk about culture. Culture is important, but the worst way to change the culture is to say, your culture is not good. right? I mean, this is why I refuse to do a culture engagement where I don't want to go in and tell people that your culture is not good, because that is the worst way. It puts people on the defensive. And I didn't talk about 1 to hundreds. The reason why I didn't talk 1 to hundreds is 1 to hundreds are an important part of our life. In fact, 10 to hundreds are a critical part of our life. We need the problem solving skills for them. What we learn right now is totally fine. We need to have enough 0 to 1s also. And that's why I chose to focus. They're an important part of our GDP, and we should not go away from them. So I hope these thoughts will inspire you to dream big and hopefully instigate a few more 0 to 1s. And this was probably a different take, Partha, on your problem solving angle, but I was trying to focus much more on the much earlier stages. Thank you for your time, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Nav. That was absolutely brilliant. I mean, what I take from your thought is the space between 0 and 1 is big. And in that space, the courage to think big is perhaps higher than the space between 1 to 100, because 0 is also infinite. So I think I would like to build on that, and that's why we'll move to the next speaker, a good friend, Dr. Peter Wiltz. And as you know, the title is Creative Tension, the Mentor's Little Helper to Developing Problem-Solving Capability. And it's all about phase transition between the quantum and the non-quantum world. So with that, back to you, Peter. Mike, you have to unmute.
That's right. I was politely muting the rest of the time. So thank you for passing over, and thank you to the previous speakers for giving so many sort of different stimuli on this topic. So let me just go back. Our topic is problem solving, the art and science of problem solving. And I have never been formally appointed as a teacher of anyone. So to all the educationalists out there, I'm a complete layperson. However, a lot of people have said to me that they learnt a lot together with me. So there's a little bit of a conundrum here, which is how come I ended up, people ended up learning when I was never appointed as their teacher. And so I wanted to investigate that a little bit. I won't talk, I mean, the domain that I did most of this in is in a specific area of lean transformation in manufacturing and in healthcare. I'm not going to talk about that today, and I'm not going to try and convince you of any of those things. But just so you know, that's the domain that I principally worked in. Now, within that, there's a lot of problem solving, and problem solving is a universe. So let me narrow it down of what I'd like to talk about today, which is not most of what goes on in problem solving. Most problem solving is normal problem solving. And what I'd like to talk about today is revolutionary problem solving. The way I see it in terms of problem solving, there are 3 entities involved. One entity is the knowledge. Is there a solution that is known? Okay, so are we talking about a known solution or not? Is there nothing known? The next entity is, in this construct that I'm going to talk about, is the mentor. So somebody who is helping somebody else to reach a problem. Okay, so that's the second actor, if you will, or second element. And the third element is the learner, the person who's going to learn, and in particular, their mind. Okay, so those are the 3 things. Now, the states that those 3 things can be in, either a solution exists or it doesn't, out there somewhere. The mentor can either know the solution or not know the solution. And the learner, let's focus on the learner's mind, the solution can be accessible to the learner's current state of mind or not. So those are the 2 states respectively that each of those 3 elements can be in. Now, the normal problem solving, one that I spent, and I'm sure all of you spend a lot of your time doing, I happen to spend it in terms of quality improvements that Jerry spoke about before. This is normal problem solving. We may not know exactly the solution to the problem of weld splatter on the door hinges of a passenger car in this particular instance, but the boundaries of that problem are pretty much known. And the process is then leading somebody to learn how to do that or to solve that particular problem. It's something that we'll find, for example, if we're trying to train, I don't know, an electrician, right? An electrician, a working, jobbing electrician, how to install something safely. So we're passing known knowledge through somebody who knows how to do it to somebody who wants to learn how to do it, and they can do it. These are very, very important things, and it's vital for our continuation and further discovery, but these are, this is not what I want to talk about today. And some of that is sort of infill knowledge. We'll come back to the notion of infill knowledge in passing. What I'd like to talk about today is revolutionary knowledge or revolutionary problem solving. And that, going back to my sort of typology of this, comes about in two states. One is where there is a solution that is known. No, I'll do it the other way around, sorry. Let's imagine there is no known solution to this. Clearly, by definition, the mentor cannot know the solution because no solution is known. So we're just left with a situation where the learner's mind is not in a state that makes possible solutions accessible. So, and here we're in true deep innovation and deep problem solving. So this would be things like, you know, how do we make a hydrogen-based economy? How do we have hydrogen cells that we can make, you know, the size of a pocketbook or something like this? How do we ensure clean water for everybody on the planet? These are the sort of problems that fall into that category. The other category that we can look at is where a solution of sorts exists. It's known by the mentor, but the current state of the learner's mind means that they can't have access to that. And there are lots of different forms in which this appears. One of them is the domain that I know well, which is a lean transformation. We know what the end state looks like. The mentor, hopefully, has got experience of that, but the company that is, or the individual or the company that is still working in a pre-lean transformation way, in a classic way, their mind they don't have access to that solution. Other examples, less from my direct experience, but let's imagine somebody who, the learner in this case, has a life of crime. You know, that's what they do. That's their life. And it makes sense to them. That's the people they know do it. You know, more or less it kind of works. And if there's an aspiration to move beyond, should we say, a life of crime, then you know that it's at that moment their mind is not, that solution is not accessible. They can't imagine how they would live their life without it being a life of crime. Or more broadly, let's take conflict resolution. So we may have a situation like we had in my country, in the United Kingdom, in Northern Ireland, where it was almost impossible for people to imagine how they would coexist peacefully and productively with people from a very slightly different faith from their own. And yet, you know, such things were possible, and the mentors who were involved in that did a tremendous job in helping them have access to the possibility of a solution that didn't involve making a big difference, a big problem out of small differences. And to bring it down to a level that I guess we can all understand, we may all have a problem of overeating and under-exercising. And somehow we can't imagine how we're going to break out of the world of sugar and starch. And yet we know that there are solutions there. We know that there are ways out of that. But how do I break the closed circle of my mind that keeps me sedentary and eating donuts? So that's what I want to look at. And I want to look at the role of the mentor in those two cases. Now, I've talked about accessibility quite a bit, and I'd just like to expand on that briefly. Now, again, in accessibility, we're not talking about what I mentioned before about infill knowledge. So filling in. So you've got some existing structures to the knowledge, and I'm just doing the hard work of filling in the knowledge. One of the ways I chose to put the time when we were locked down in this country with the initial wave of COVID was to learn a new language. So I'm I'm learning Russian as it happens. And once you come to terms with the fact that there are only 3 tenses and there are different things like aspects and so on in Russian, the hard work is the infill work of learning 500 verbs that have very different formats to the ones we're used to. That's just hard infill knowledge, just hard work. The sort of accessibility that I'm referring to here is one where we are bounded. And I think my previous speakers both addressed this, right? Where we have our existing world has a sufficient explanation, right? So I'm justifying to myself why I don't exercise this afternoon, or everybody I know supports me in my life of crime. So I've got a sufficient explanation of why it is that way. I have a way of doing things that kind of works. Okay, that bounds me to seeing other possibilities, and it's a sort of complete explanation. So these are things that can reduce my accessibility or reduce my ability to access other solutions. So the question is then, okay, if we accept that, and I have the role as a mentor or somebody who's trying to help somebody else, what I have to do then, I can't do that by passing on knowledge. That doesn't really work, not in this situation. It helps if somebody can help me with my 153rd Russian verb, but these sort of situations, it's not passing on knowledge in that sense. And like the electrician who learns from their teacher. So we have to do something else, and our task is to bring the mind of the learner into what I would call a critical state. And that's why we're talking about creative tension. This is what we're trying to, in this case, what I suggest we're trying to do is to bring the mind of the learner into a critical state. And here we don't have time to go into it, but of course this is referring to things like the non-equilibrium physics that Partha referred to earlier, when we are talking about the transition from one state to another. These are just analogies in this case, right? So the situation of the tension in the earth before an earthquake, the way societies transition from pre-revolutionary states, the shot that was fired at Sarajevo, and we ended up 6 months later stuck in trenches and dying by our millions. These are examples of these critical states where events push us or transform us into a different, certainly out of our current equilibrium, but into a different equilibrium. Now, I'd want to briefly talk about to illustrate this, I'd like to talk about the difference, as I see it, between a crisis and an emergency. I'm not sure these aren't formal definitions, and this is just initially me talking to myself, and now me talking to you. So for me, an emergency is where things that we are used to happen faster or more extremely than they have happened in the past. So if you think of an emergency, something happens, a fire breaks out and so on. The way we prepare for an emergency is drill. We routine. We have routines, like, so if your fire drill tries to train in the right behavior so that when the emergency happens, we fall back to that standard. So when the fire breaks out, we don't all run at the same time and try and squeeze through the door. We've got a trained response to that. So I see emergencies more as a reinforcement of the things that we know and a reinforcement of our standard ways of responding to those. A crisis, and I see as differently, which is where we are in a situation where situations emerge where the things that have worked so far don't work, where we reach the limits of the effectiveness, where there are phenomenon, evidence, things coming at us that don't fit into our structure or our pattern of a complete answer to things that work, what I was referring to before. So that's how I contrast the notion of emergency and crisis. And of course, if we take the word crisis and the word critical state, there is a linguistic link, right, between a crisis and a critical state. So that's why I'm saying part of what we're trying to do is to bring the mind of the learner into the critical state. So why does anybody need, why does it need a mentor to bring the learner into a critical state? And again, in most cases, with a very few exceptions, I think our minds, our human minds, are stay in their equilibrium. They are not, as we would put it in the sort of the non-equilibrium physics side of this, we are not self-organizing. We don't self-organize into a critical state. Okay, so we are not tectonic plates. Hello? No, we're not tectonic plates where the movement of the plates naturally brings the whole system into a critical state. On the contrary, we like to, metaphorically put our feet up and turn the heating up, put our feet up and eat a donut or two. So that's why there is a role for the mentor to bring us into that state. So if we accept that, then there's a question, well, how? What are the ways that we can do that as a mentor? And I'm going to draw on my experience as a mentor, effectively. I mean, not formally appointed, but apparently effective, but also with clients in the broader sense of this inducing lean transformation into successful companies, but also my experience as a learner. And I had, three situations or three different times when I was lucky enough to have this sort of effect going on. One was I was lucky enough to go for my first degree to Balliol College in Oxford, and there we still do have the tutorial system. So every week you show up with the world authority on some subject, and they've tossed you out a topic the week before, and you've read a few books and scribbled something down and show up and read it out loud in front of this world expert. There is no hope that you're going to ever teach them anything directly in that sense, unfortunately, not in terms of the substance, but their job, I understand with a lot of years of hindsight, what they were essentially doing was trying to, bring me into that experience of challenge my own assumptions, challenging my own ability to express those as well. The second one was learning with my Japanese teachers when way back, just after Partha and I met in Düsseldorf. I ended up on the hard end, on the blunt end of serving Japanese customers in the automotive industry. And I learned from them in their particular way, which again, we won't go into, but it was very, very specific. And it was very much focused around some of the things I'm going to talk about in a minute. It was a true mentoring with a lot of attention, an understanding of the mindset of the person who is being helped, okay? And the third one, as I just throw in as a third one, is that that I had some very, very interesting experiences during my time in the Zen monastery. And the Zen teachers have a very particular approach to leading you into the critical state. So these are very kind of different experiences that led me to think this way. So how do we do it practically? What are our practical options as if we're going to be in this role? You'll find a lot of the time we talk about asking questions. It's kind of sometimes just defaults that the mentor just asks the questions. Not a bad guess, if you will, because if you remember one of the cases or the situations that I outlined at the beginning is where the solution is not known, the mentor doesn't know the solution to this problem, but they're trying to help the learner access a solution. So it's pretty obvious we would go through with questions. One thing to avoid here is to see this simply in terms of a version of Socratic dialogue or a Socratic approach. I'm afraid, misunderstood Socratic approach, which we sometimes see under that name, which is through questions, I help the learner discover what they already know, as if there's no need to bring any additional knowledge. It's like, you know it already. I just need to ask questions and you've got it. For me, it's interesting. It's a different approach. It's not actually historically Socratic. What that did do, and what is relevant here, what Socratic approach did do, which was very formally to take any held view or any proposition from a participant, and by very deep questioning, reveal the assumptions behind that point of view or that knowledge, and then to demonstrate contradictions or inconsistencies. And therefore, it was more about demonstrating what you don't know than actually helping you to know what you do. All right, when we formally take the Socratic approach. However, there's a very interesting status or state that's created through that approach, which is the status of aporia. That's, I don't know if I get the Greek pronunciation right, aporia. And aporia is this doubt that is induced by the Socratic questioning, all right? So that's a state that in a rigorously applied Socratic approach, you're trying to achieve. And to Jerry's point about him waking up in the morning next to his wife, Adler, as in the psychological world, in the world of psychology, Adler in particular drew on this heritage, the Socratic heritage of aporia, and through the questioning and through the approach in the psychological or even psychoanalytical approach, led the subject to understand the things that they didn't know, their contradictions, and then actually led them to a critical state. So it's a very interesting topic around Adler's approach. The other thing beyond questions is challenges. And so a challenge is a very interesting way of bringing a learner into the critical state. And these are a challenge in this particular one is an action that can't be solved using your existing mind. Okay, so this is not infill knowledge or normal problem solving. This is, I give you a challenge that I know you can't solve the way you're thinking. And to go back to my couple of previous experiences that I mentioned, those of you familiar, this is partly what a Zen koan is designed to do. All right, it's a question, which is a challenge because you have to solve the riddle, and you can't solve that riddle with your pre-mind, so to speak. All right, so the koan is a very deliberate attempt. Perhaps more prosaically and closer to our experience, the method of the Japanese manager, and I'm conscious of the fact that I'm here with Partha, so I've no doubt he has plenty of scope to contradict me, but the method of the Japanese, and I'm talking particularly of the people that I knew and people I knew who'd have been through this experience in the automotive industry, is a series of challenges, right? So they would set challenges very deliberately for the individual based on their understanding of that individual's capability, but current mindset. And as part of my work in consulting, I recruited many people around the world from Toyota and Nissan in particular. And one thing they had in common, they're all very diverse, but one thing they had in common was a story about their mentor, who was their manager, their mentor. And one of the things they always said was the mentor, the manager, never once told me what to do. Never once told me what to do. And was that exceptional because these people were, you know, some sort of trainee or something? They said, no, that's, you know, most of the time they never once told me what to do. They asked me questions, they set me challenges, they drove me mad, they drove me to the edge of reason, and I love them to death and I'm still in touch with them. Okay, I mean, that was a kind of a common theme that ran through all of these stories. So challenges, very particular challenges designed with great detail, based around an understanding of the individual. Now, the final thing I would like to talk about is, almost the final thing I'd like to talk about is, so how do we actually articulate this? So one is the challenges and one is the questions, another is the questions. But what the movement from the inner movement of the learner to the critical state, we resist. Okay, it's painful, it's uncomfortable, we resist. We have lots and lots of ways of resisting. And one of the ways of resisting is through what I would call the inner rhetoric. So the notion, I mean, the business of rhetoric is, I mean, in its proper sense, in its classical sense. I'm not talking about how we talk about it in the news or something where it's got a bad rap over the last few hundred years. but I'm talking classical rhetoric. So that the ability, the structured ability to influence. And I firmly believe that there is an inner rhetoric that we use. And in this particular case, there is an inner rhetoric that each of us, when we're in this position, use to convince ourselves not to change. Okay, we make sure that we don't so. And it's all of the classic things that you would find in rhetoric. So we have sort of various ad hominem attempts. So when the facts of the logic come in our face, right, we try selective blindness. We have all of the classic things of ignoring the facts that don't fit our plan or don't fit our scheme or our pattern. We use inconsequential logic, right? Very deliberate devices that we would use in rhetoric as well, to slip away from a difficult situation that might make us change. And when all else fails, as we do in rhetoric, I would use an ad hominem attack. I would just go straight for, in this case, it's an internal dialogue. So I would criticize myself, right? Just as a person, as opposed to looking at the substance of what's going on. So this, I think this internal rhetoric is happening the whole time to try to keep the individual away from the critical state, okay? And therefore, making sure they don't, I mean, in essence, ending up meaning that the solution remains not accessible. So the mentor has to really understand this in great detail. You have to think about what is the internal rhetoric that's going on with this person. I'll extend it beyond people in a minute, but with this person. They also go back to the sort of physics of instability or physics of critical states. You have to think, where are the lines of instability, right? Where is the point at which if I tap on this, the rock shatters, right? So it's very, very particular thought about how you do that. And when we were doing the lean transformations, we had great ways of doing this that we inherited from some of our Japanese colleagues. We would send people, we would have experienced, successful, competent, well-regarded people going to the shop floor of their own factory to discover that 95% of the movement and activity on their shop floor was not adding any value, for example. All right, and they'd spent years working on, telling themselves or explaining, quantifying how they'd reached efficiency levels of whatever, 95%, or in some cases, even 105%, and so on. So we would have these very particular, simple methods of leading people to that, and understanding where their lines of instability, where you tap on the rock for it to shatter. And so then applying, this rhetorical intervention, and you've got to think of it in those ways. It's a rhetorical intervention. We can either do it with the aim of a specific change. So if you're a mentor, you're trying to lead somebody to a particular destination, you have that in mind. As we were doing with the lean transformation, we knew where we wanted to get people to. So it was very deliberate. Or you can actually not know. You just say, I respect this learner so much that I want to open their mind. I want to open their mind to make solutions accessible. I don't even know what those solutions are. And you can imagine that is, the heritage of, some of our best universities, of course, will be doing that partially. You could be running, you could imagine that as the director of an educational institution, the director of a large research group. And you say, that's what I do. I don't know the science and the technology of all of these people in my research. I can't possibly know it. But what my contribution is, I've created an organization where either the individual or the institutional rhetoric is such that it brings people into this critical state that makes solutions accessible that weren't before. So interestingly, I've talked mainly about a mentor as a person and a learner as a person. It's not entirely surprising, but maybe it's a little bit whimsical. I mean, this thing is scale invariant, okay? So not surprising if we're talking about critical states. So it works if it's one-to-one. The same, all of the things that I've talked about here work when we're talking one mentor, one person. It also works if we're talking a mentor to a group. It also works in the same dynamic between a mentor or a group, or a leadership group and a community, and it works at a country and a level. So it's kind of scale and variant. The same things happen whether we're talking one-to-one or sort of world-to-world. By the way, I should mention that it is also agnostic. You can use all of this for good or for evil, okay? And evildoers are very, very, very experienced in using these things, right? So deliberately bringing a society into a critical state because you want to destabilize it. So let's take simple examples. The burning of the Reichstag, all right, is an example of a very deliberate attempt to destabilize and to bring a society, or bring a country in that case, into a critical state. So people will use this, again, at all levels, and that will happen one-to-one as well. So it's agnostic, just so we're aware of it. It can be used for good or for evil. So that creating this critical tension, right? That was the way we got into this, creating this critical tension deliberately, specifically, with a lot of attention to the characteristics of the learner, is the mentor's little helper. It's just a little idea. It's just a little helper that can make a big change. So with that, I'm done, and I guess I'm passing back to Partha.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. It was absolutely brilliant. I must say I'm in a state of disequilibrium. The disequilibrium has happened in my mind, and you have played clearly the role of a mentor today to the group. But what I find is interesting that the same individual's ability to transition from being a mentor to mentee to mentee to mentor is perhaps the real challenge. For someone to assume I'm the permanent mentor itself challenges the fundamental concept that you have shared, where we have to continuously avoid selective blindness. So I think it was absolutely brilliant, and I could see how the different dots came together, which I'll try to summarize later. I'll pass it back to Devender. You may want to invite Dr. Sanjeev Chopra to reflect on all this, and what does it mean for the role, a very important role that he plays in the context of developing leadership in India, particularly in the government. And I think all the speakers made a point that the governments can make a fundamental difference because they have to have the ability to think big, think systems, only when they apply their mind. So with that, maybe Devender, you could introduce Dr. Chopra and invite him. You're muted.
Right, thank you. So now let me take the privilege to invite Dr. Sanjeev Chopra, Director of Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration, India, the apex body which trains the administrators of India who then solve the complex problems of the world's most diverse country and the largest democracy. Now over to you, Dr. Chopra.
Thank you, Devender, and thank you very much for Dr. Partha S Ghosh and for all the speakers. It was really wonderful to listen and connect to all of you. I had to, leave in the middle because of another engagement which I had. But I think it's very, very important, especially because the Academy has been working with the Center for Creative Leadership, and we've had some discussions with them on how to evolve a program which will look at change, not just at the time of training, because one of the things is that, that change has to be a continuous process, and you have to live in an ecosystem of change. Unfortunately, the general impression about the government is that governments are unchanging entities. I think because of years of experience and the way we have reacted over several years, the general impression, I don't find fault with the way people look at us. They look at us as being, bureaucratic, as being very wooden, as not having adequate windows, as not, being able to connect the dots, and not being able to lead the change in the ecosystem. But I think many things are changing. Many things are changing, and especially because First of all, let me just explain that, while we all realize that change is good, we all realize that, and taking on from the point that, we have to understand the ecosystem. And I think one of the most fundamental jobs which a civil servant has in a country as diverse as India, in a country which is politically as dynamic as India, because it is not a situation like, for example, one should not be comparing, but it's not like a question like in the case of China, where if the Politburo decides that this shall be done, then it can be done immediately. Here, one of the major challenges for us is to create consensus, is to get a certain degree of acceptance. And that is where I think the whole concept of Zen, which ultimately comes from dhyana, is a very important thing that all of us have to learn, that how do we connect the dots in a manner which is not adversarial? Because let us also realize that, you see, a lot of changes that we want to bring about in the short run appear to be a zero-sum game. It is only when you look at, when we look at life, or when you look at India in a much longer perspective, that we realize that these contradictions that we see are contradictions in the short run. Therefore, the concept of time becomes very important for us, because one of the things which I want to share with everyone is that, unlike a corporate body where the goals and directions are very clear, in the civil services there is the larger constitution to which we all we've all sworn our allegiance. There is a democratically elected government. It could be different in the state and in the center. And as Partha knows, I mean, if you have to deal with both West Bengal government and the government of India at the same time, it requires great diplomatic, it requires challenges of an order which are phenomenal. You understand what I'm trying to say, and I'm sure other panelists would also understand. Therefore, one of the challenges for us when we want to bring about change is that not only does it have to be politically acceptable, because if the bureaucracy wants to bring about change which is not politically acceptable in the short run, then you're going to end up against a wall. So one of the big challenges which I have, when we were being trained here in the academy about 30, 40 years ago, 35 years ago to be precise, at that point of time, the thought which was being told to us is that, look, you are knights in the shining armor because you've cracked this IAS exam, now you go and change the world. Now, after 30 years of service, I feel that this is not how it happens. Change cannot happen unless you take people along. And unless you've taken your adversary along, unless you let your adversary feel that in fact, there are no adversaries. In the case of primary education or health, for example, where is the adversary? There is no adversary in primary education. And yet the way systems are structured makes it appear as if the local municipal councillor and the interest of the principal of the school and the interest of the political party is at variance. So primary job of a civil servant today, or the job of the sub-inspector of school, which I keep telling them, is to break these narrow silos, to break the silos in which people think that they are operating. Because in order to be successful in a country which is in the throes of transition, you have to have a plan of action which is politically acceptable, which is socially good, which makes economic sense, and which will not land you in trouble. Because at the end of the day, a civil servant must protect his own job and must protect his own turf. So having said that, I think the biggest challenge, especially in the area of education and health, is to get the various players in the ecosystem realize that you have to look at life not in the next 5 years or 10 years, but you have to look at life in the next 20 years, 30 years, so that the contradictions which appear today will not appear to be contradictions. And that is where I think we require to be disruptive in our thoughts, but not disruptive in our actions. And I think it's a very important learning which I saw today. I'm sorry I had to leave, but that was a commitment that I had made a long time ago before Devinder roped me into this. I had to release a certain video series at that point of time. But I think at the Academy, I would like to share this recording with my academic council. And we will be very happy to engage to see how we can bring about that fundamental transformation in thought process. And I must mention here that today, for instance, we have realized in government. I mean, not me, but what I'm saying is that the political system has realized that unless there is a continuous learning curve for the bureaucracy, we cannot have a program. You see, typically what used to happen in our times was, that we were trained as probationers, as officer trainees, and then you were let loose. I mean, there was nothing after that. Now, of course, the whole idea is that under the new Karam Yogi platform that we have, that officers will pick up the areas that they want to learn and learn continuously at their own pace, at their own time, and keep on engaging, So I think this is a transformation which has happened very recently. The change is certainly happening. Change is not happening at the pace which is noticeable, but there is a certain change, and there's a certain willingness to learn and accept from all across the world. And there is the assistance of technology that we are now getting. So I think the ecosystem changes that we are looking at. I would say that what we are trying to do here is to let our young officers realize that they have to listen more, that they have to be non-adversarial, and they have to understand the ecosystem very well before they start bringing about those changes, which is not going to make them lose their jobs, which is going to strengthen their position and look at changes in the very, very long run, rather than look at piecemeal changes, because that is what we learned in the very first point that was made, that suddenly there's a famine in Somalia and you rush in the food. No, that's not go about it that way. Let's try to understand why this is happening, and a continuous dialogue is what we look at. And I'm very grateful to Boston, for letting me in, and especially to Devendra. I've enjoyed this, and I hope that we'll keep our engagement continuous. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chopra. Thank you for your valuable inputs. And what you have just mentioned, this is exactly in line with the Boston Pledge mission. We are trying to make the future generation confident problem solvers. And you have laid down 3 very important points: be receptive, be non-adversarial, and be a visionary. So these are the 3 important traits which the young administrators of a country of 1.35 billion people is in dire need of. Thank you very much for these valuable points. Now, I hand over the dais to Dr. Ghosh. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know where to begin, where to end, but firstly, Dr. Chopra, thank you very much for the work that you're doing in the country, because you're absolutely right. If you have to pick one country which has got the most complex problems, if you have to pick one country which is the most diverse, if you pick one country which is resource constrained vis-a-vis the nature of the problems that we deal with, it is clearly the subcontinent of India. When I think of India, I think of the old India, all the way from Pakistan to Bangladesh, from Kashmir to Sri Lanka, because that's the India the world has known for the last 7,000 years, not the India that we have known for the last 75 years. So thank you for the leadership that you're providing, and we would definitely like to engage with you and see what role we could play. In fact, one of the promises of Quantum Logic Consulting that I know is to work on such issues on leadership, and as does Boston Pledge. And I know my friends Jerry, Nav, and Peter would also be delighted to work with, including Jahangir, to all come together to see how we could experiment with the ideas. But I think it's important for me to as the anchor of this program, to first share with the highest amount of humility and deepest level of reverence to all the 3 speakers, what we have learned and how we could connect the dots. And I think that is an effort, Peter, you as my mentor now, I would like to make, to get into a very difficult area of connecting what I had to say at the beginning and what Dr. Chopra had to say at the end, and 3 of you in the middle. I think the big message that we have evolved together is that the world is indeed full of problems. We cannot afford to be reactive. We have to learn how to anticipate and proactive, where we have to unlock the power of imagination. That is one point. And that's what you are saying, Peter, is to getting to the critical state. How do we advance our mind to the critical state? The second point which came out is what Nav was talking about, and he articulated beautifully from multiple angles, the space between 0 and 1, and how do we move from 0 to 1, let alone from 1 to 100 to 100 to 1,000. But the big point that I picked up from Nav's point is the boldness, the thinking big, thinking like, I love the person that we have right now in middle of us is Elon Musk. Thinking big and taking on the challenges, living with it and enjoying it. I think we need to cultivate that spirit of Elon Musk in millions of people. There's no reason to believe that we cannot move into that state of disequilibrium. Peter, I'm borrowing from you the term. That ultimately comes to the point of what Jerry was talking about. To get there, to think big, our ability to connect the dots, some which I said visible, some invisible, but it needs a systems thinking, that you have to think of the ecosystem and see where you could find the Zen. Goes back to what Peter you talked about in Japan, and both you and I had the unique opportunity to spend a lot of time in Japan. And indeed, the lessons from Zen, lessons from Kaizen comes into play as we connect with the need to be bold at the interface. Which leads to my final chart that I had is how do we help the mentees, if we look at the young minds as our mentees, and we put ourselves in the role of a mentor, though I believe each individual's ability to switch roles from being a mentor to mentee, from mentee to mentor is extremely important. But as soon as we stop learning and we believe we can help the mentor to access, again, Peter, I'm borrowing your term, to access possible solutions which we do not know, or access problems that we do not know, but if addressed could lead to interesting solution. I think we have to help to cultivate the courage on one side, the other side, the state of consciousness, the two dimensions that I had in my last exhibit. And that journey, one along the dimension of courage, we have to continuously unfold our need to become more courageous. That connects with the point Nam was talking about, being bold, thinking big, or Dr. Chopra, you talked about the nature of problems that our IS officers have to deal with the highest amount of humility. At the same time, have the confidence to uncover possibilities with desire to explore the unknown. It goes back to where I quoted Tagore, where we talked about within the known, how do I search for the unknown? The other point Tagore is to talk about within the limits, how do I connect with the unlimited? I think that is the challenge of our times. When you look at the United States today, it is full of problems. Peter talked about the United Kingdom. When we look at China, we look at India, when you look at Japan, there is not a single country which is not dealing with what, Peter, you talked about, the state of disequilibrium. The nature of disequilibrium are different, but United States is clearly in a state of disequilibrium. There's a huge divide. So is United Kingdom. So is Japan, where Japan is continuously wrestling with the fact that for the last 25 years, after a brilliant period between 1950 to 1990, it has been a state of kind of flat line, or if not decline. China is making a major transition and trying to make a major transition from being a highly centralized state of the economy to decentralized, yet capitalistic, but state-owned economy. How do we manage it? And it is still a poor country, which often we do not realize. Its per capita income is only $15,000, clearly 5 times that of the United States. In fact, this afternoon, I'll be talking to my students about US-China tensions. So I think the world is looking for problem solvers. And I think today's session, between what Jerry had to talk in the name of systems thinking, what Nav, you talked about the space between 0 and 9, I love that. And of course, Peter, which is, as I expected, you would connect the Zen with your experience in Germany and the automotive industry with multiple dimensions of thought processes that you're going through, including learning Russian, I think brings together a lot of thoughts to work on. I would promise each one of you that I'll try to write a paper on what you guys discussed. I would need your input because I think we did discuss a lot of fundamental things. It reminds me of some of the discussions now we would appreciate we used to have in the Partners Conference, olden days, not the new McKinsey, but the old McKinsey. I'm talking about the Marvin Power McKinsey. And we used to have such chats. What does problem solving mean in the 21st century? And I think this changed. You're absolutely right. The way we look at the past and the way we have to look at the future has to be different. And I think that is the summary. So with that, I think we should invite any questions and comments for the next. We have time till 12 o'clock, am I right? Or till 11:30? 12. Maybe let's make it 11:45 if you, and which is our Boston time, 11:45. So the time is 45 minutes. And now it's 38. So why don't we have any questions, comments, thoughts, including the speakers, because you want to react to each other's points. Jahangir, would you like to kick off with a question?
Yes, I'm still thinking. There's so much to really absorb. I do just a very quick 20-mile overview of the whole situation. The topics is that from Jerry, I got that we really need to think differently. You cannot be reactive. You really have to be proactive because, by being reactive, quick fix really creates more problems. It does not fundamentally change anything whatsoever. It just changed the dimension of it. Okay. And from NAB's discussion, brilliant discussion. All of them are brilliant discussions. It's we to understand 0 to 1 problem, 0 to 1 situation. All you have to do is to take a look at some of the innovative companies. The minute a 757 aircraft takes from Boston to Heathrow, it's a 6-hour flight, but on the way it generates about 3 terabytes worth of data. This 3 terabytes worth of data is a very valuable piece of information to so many people to do so many things. So it's the process that generates so many different ideas. Look at Facebook. Facebook is trying to create a new currency, but the process has created a very different way to process transactions across borders. Okay, so that's what Facebook is really interested. So these started out as crazy ideas, and then these crazy ideas are just generating new way to think to solve world's problem. And one more comment. We've been told that so-and-so candidate is really a very bright candidate because she can think out of the box. I fundamentally disagree with that concept, that there should not be any box, okay? The candidate should be hired on her ability to basically create ideas which are not defined by any dimension, for example. And the last thing I found out from Peter's point is that there has to be a very strong connection between mentor and mentee to push the mentee to the critical stage by throwing questions, creating doubts in the learner's point, challenge the learner. That's what educators, a true mentor, really should be doing. So at this point, I want to thank everyone, but there is a question that has been raised, and let me read that question, and I'm going to invite response by any of the speakers. So the question says, there is one interesting thing about preempting problems and solving them proactively. You don't get credit for solving them. Perhaps one of the reasons why politicians let a problem explode and then get into the problem-solving mode is that people then come to know a problem was solved. The ones who did not let problems surface by preempting them often do not get recognized or re-elected or rewarded. Anyone would like to respond to that?
Nav.
Yeah, so
Does work with a lot of governments.
no, and it's just on governments, right? Look, it is also about, look, I came up with this idea. I don't want to share this. I may not get recognized for it. I think my philosophy as a 0-1 thinker is share with as many people as you can, because it'll lead to more ideas. So I think I go back to Jerry's like systems point, right? I mean, in my mind, we should not be afraid. I mean, so what if they don't recognize us? It is their problem. It's not your problem. Why would you make it your problem? Right? So in my mind, I think it is all about practice. Problem solving gets better with practice. The more you solve problems, the better you are like getting by the day. If recognition comes, fine. If not, fine. At least your mind is getting much sharper by the day.
That's a very philosophical. But anyone, Jerry?
Yeah, I would just like to add as well about this notion of getting credit. Maybe this is referencing specifically the government world, but I remember the thesis in the book Good to Great, when Collins talks about the level 5 leader, which is maybe something that we should all aspire to, almost like the top point of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But the level 5 leader is that type of leader who, when things go bad, he or she takes the responsibility for things going south, for being bad. But the level 5 leader, when things go well, praises his teams, praises his workforce, praises her associates, and is very modest about this. So, a lot of us in this world, I think, we want the praise, we want the spotlight on us, but I think that there's a maturity there of really respecting those around us who make our organizations great and who make our people great, and just understanding that you're just a part of this. It doesn't have to be on you. So I'm definitely agreeing with what Nav's saying, or what I'm sure the others are saying, that it doesn't. Now, the flip side of that a little bit, the shadow side of that is we don't give enough recognition to our people. It seems that right now I'm going through a process in my class at Tufts that they will be receiving the results of a 360-degree assessment, leadership assessment, that they've all taken, and it's finally been scored. We'll talk about them next week, one-on-one. And the thing that I love about this, as a pedagogical tool, is my students, they're all engineers, they all work very hard. And when do they get feedback about their world? It's usually in the form of this fake kind of performance review that a manager looks on their calendar and says, oh my God, this week I have to give performance reviews. I've never told the person what I'm going to be judging them on. I have to do it because it's on my calendar and that's how I get paid. And I know that's a very cynical view. I apologize, but it's true, I think. But now I can give the one-on-one data to my students from their bosses, from their peers, from their direct reports. And we're going to make meaning together of this very robust instrument, and we're going to spend hours on it. It's 40 pages long. And there's both a quantitative aspect, which I thought engineers would love. But about 5 or 6 years ago, the Center for Creative Leadership, which created this assessment, has added a qualitative portion of this where managers and bosses can definitely say your areas of strength and your areas for development. So we as leaders have to do a better job of praising our workers, because they're the ones who make the company look good, make us look good. So I'm going to get off my soapbox, and I hope that's a little bit of added response to what you guys have already said.
Peter, any thoughts on that? You're muted.
You're muted, Peter.
It's fine. I was just acknowledging that I was muted.
Peter always have got very quick answers. Yeah, Peter.
No, I was just saying the example. I mean, in terms of the question as it was posed, we can actually go further, of course, which is that there are those dysfunctional situations where problems are deliberately created to provide the means to have an activity of solving them. So it's not that's not unknown. I mean, I know I've lived and worked in countries where laws and regulations are either deliberately or willfully allowed to grow over each other, so that the law-abiding citizen is unable to carry out any activity without contravening one or the other of overlapping or contradictory laws, which gives immense opportunity for the tax authorities, the traffic cop, the holder of a rubber stamp, to justify their existence. So it can get worse than just sort of, not taking that. There is a whole world out there that that deliberately creates problems. Not that they may be solved, but that they may be solved in the Somali starvation way, which is you have a sort of solution to it, but it doesn't change anything underlying. And if you try to have reforms, then of course that those vested interests of living from appearing to solve problems that you've created will just come up again.
Good. Let me respond to this point, because the question is still remain unanswered, I think, and it's very difficult to answer, because what Nav, you said, why we have to take the credit, or what Peter, you just said, yeah, there are people out there who love to create problems to justify their existence. So the real challenge then is that people who get into the positions of power, either through election or through rising through the administrative process, or even the corporate world, when they get into the positions of power, how do we instill in them the sense that Nav talked about, that why do I need the credit? But we as philosophers, as teachers, as consultants, may feel that way. And I know we are all genuine, that I don't need the credit. I want to serve and enjoy the process of serving. But unfortunately, such people are in a minority. People out there, particularly people who have reached those positions of power, how do we help them to solve problems proactively and not worry about the credit and be the leaders? And that's where I think, Dr. Chopra, your leadership academy that you're talking about, we would love to get engaged, is extremely important, because we have not done that. We're helping others who tend to be selfish to justify their role, to become selfless. And I think that's one takeaway I have. So obviously I don't have an answer. It's a very good question, but that is the way the world, yeah.
I think this is the key issue, right? And if you go back to our own roots, right, we talk about like karma, right? You do the right things and good things happen to you. In my mind, I think my unlock for my own leadership style was help as many people as you can. Right. So, and if you do the simple math, if you help 100 people out, maybe 20 won't help you back. Guess what? 80 are going to help you.
That's true.
It's a pretty big number. So the math and the logic works for you. If you have ideas, if you have game-changing things, just do it. Do your like karma, and good things will ultimately come back to you. So I actually go back to our like philosophical roots that have been taught to us over ages. There's a lot of value and merit to that. And I think if you're looking for the transaction, that if you're waiting for the transaction, you'll be miserable, because most likely you will not be happy. So if you want to pursue happiness when you are in a position of strength, where you're just contributing more than you're getting, that is a position of strength. That, in my mind, is happiness at times. If you're worried about, hey, did somebody notice me or not? By the way, they didn't notice me for this, they might notice me for something else. I go back to roots around like karma.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I'm fully with you, but we have to spread that.
Yeah.
We have to spread that. Dr. Chopra wants to say a few words. Yes, Dr. Chopra.
Yeah, in fact, just wanted to thank Nev for this thing, because in fact, we keep reinforcing the fact that the emblem of the IAS is the yoga karma sukoshalam. That is, yoga is excellence in action. And that is why, all throughout, which I keep telling them is that do not look at what you've achieved as an SDM or as a DM. Look at life in a 30-year, 40-year, 50-year span. And you see, one of the things which I keep telling all our officers is that, look, we are very blessed, because there are many who are brighter than us but who have not made it. Now that we made it, and it's a fact that, and again, the point is that everybody cannot be a leader. I think half the time we're talking about managers, half the time we're talking about successful people who are successful in doing the job which they've been assigned to do. What we are talking about is people who are changing the way we are looking at things. We're looking at making a difference in a very different kind of way, right? So that is where the point, in fact, the point which was being made that, are the laws being made in a manner that give a lot of power to the traffic cop, to the policeman, to the school teacher. Now, this is where I find that when we adopt a non-adversarial and a long-term plan, when you look at a 15-year perspective, a 20-year perspective, then we can bring about a positive change by taking people along. And I think taking people along is one of the most difficult challenges for public systems. Now, there's a difference between the way Elon Musk and Satya Nadella and all these people think, because they're looking at an enterprise system. Bureaucracy and public systems are, by the very nature, slightly different because you have to take people along. And I think that itself is a leadership, that itself is an aspect of creativity. And yesterday, when we were celebrating Mahatma's birthday and also Shastri's birthday together yesterday, we were, trying to think of what is it that because something's very clear again from what Neva said. You see, we all realize that after a certain point of time, all our material needs are met. So beyond that point, and that is the inspiration which can come only when we look at life in a much longer perspective. And I think it's very important for us all to realize the point which Partha also made, that are we looking, individual destiny is 10, 15, 20 years. When you look at a millennial collect, when you look at across civilizations, when you look at the connect between India and Japan, India and Korea, even in spite of all the fight that India and China currently have, I think if you look at it in terms of centuries, we have a different feel altogether. And I think this is what we have to convey to those we have the privilege of being mentors to. And I like this whole idea about being a mentor and a mentee. It's a very, very good thought process. And I think it's been a lovely conversation. I really enjoyed it. I'm sorry I had to leave from 7:45 to about 8:20 for another commitment, and I missed most of the 0 to 1 thing. But I think I'll hear the recording and we'll get back. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
We will do it again.
Partha, let me add a question here.
Yeah.
I think my observation from Dr. Chopra in terms of leadership is that we really have to look the transition of government, in a different way. Typically what happens, one political party assumes power, the first thing what they do, they get rid of the existing bureaucrats, administrators, they say, okay, it was a new political process, new system. By doing that, in the process, they get rid of a lot of good administrators, a lot of good leaders, simply because they want to make sure their regime lasts. But they fail to understand one thing, the fundamental fact that a person living in a stark poverty in Louisiana or Somalia, those problems did not change. The only thing that happened is that the political system got changed at the very, very top. So we really have to see how we can be less disruptive in terms of maintaining something that worked, instead of just getting rid of en masse all the people and put your own political appointees, that is a fundamental problem, not only in the States, everywhere you can think of.
Very good. We should take one. Sorry, carry on.
If I could just respond. You see, this has been a problem for ages. The contest between competence and loyalty has always been there. Therefore, my suggestion to all the young officers is to not align too much with any group, as long as you are clear about what you are doing. And look, I must say, that in India, for instance, there's such protection of 311, the article. And I have worked with all political parties, from BJP to Congress to Trinamool Congress to the CPM. I have not had a problem. Because as long as you're not wanting to put yourself in front, I think that's the point which Ned made. Look, I want to distribute Kisan credit cards in my district, but let somebody take the credit for that. Am I here in the business of taking credit? This is precisely the point which I tell my young civil servants, that when you have opted to be a civil servant, you have opted to be nameless and faceless. You have opted. It's a choice. Look, I was at some point of time the vice president and the president of the Students' Union of JNU. I could have moved into politics. I could have moved into writing. I could have moved into being a public intellectual, but no. I decided, and all of us decide, what is it that we are most comfortable with. I'm comfortable with all the perks of the government. So, I mean, how can I have all the perks of the government and still be a public intellectual? I cannot be till I retire. So I think all of us must also realize where we stand in life. What is the position we've taken in life? Is it a conscious position? If it's a conscious position you've taken, then within the domain of what you are doing, do the very best that you can do. And I tell you, we can make such major changes without taking credit for it. The problem is when you want to take credit for it. You know, if I want to take credit for giving Kisan credit cards, Mamata Banerjee won't be happy. But if I say, no, it is her program, she's doing it, she's happy, my work is done, where's the problem? So that is what we have to do. I mean, that is at least what I think civil servants are supposed to do.
Excellent. You know, we have a last question and then we will wrap up. The question is from Elsie Mayo. She's, by the way, is the McKinsey alum, and we have got 3-4 people from McKinsey. So I think in that spirit, I'll read out the question. These approaches may be agnostic, as was said by Peter, but the existential problem of our time are not. Gross inequity of well-being among humans, the crisis of climate dynamics. What is the container for application that will make the difference on these life and death issues?
Yes, so I think that Partha,
who will take it on?
No, so like I can start. In my mind, I think I was struck a few years ago when I was in this class and they said, look, if you're in a traffic jam, what would you do? And my conclusion was, and I think there were people saying, look, I'll listen to radio, I will just calm down, I'll make my phone calls. And my conclusion was, I'll go solve the traffic jam. And that's what I've done, right? So I think there's some problems you can take on and some problems you can't. And I love Dr. Chopra's comments. You can't solve the whole world like tomorrow. There are some things you can solve. And if we all personally led, 7 billion people led to solve small things, you can move the needle by a long, long way. So for example, this whole issue around income inequity, right? If you in the US, for example, I've done the math for the US, I'm sure it holds for India also, put in $1,000 in the account of every baby born, that number begins to grow. If you look at the average African American when they retire, they make close to $5,000, they have $5,000 after a whole lifetime of work. That $1,000 that I'm talking about multiplies over like 70 years to grow to $200,000 to $800,000. And there's some simple practical ideas that can go a long way. And we all individually have the power to do that. We may not do it for everybody, we can do it for a few people. So in my mind, the name of the game, if you truly want to move the needle, is to figure out what you're truly enthusiastic about, that you're able to personally spend some time on, and just go do it. There's no reason, even if you touch 4 or 5 people, you move the needle. I mean, I'm not sure why people wait for a perfect answer, because I would say imperfect is good, is like good enough.
Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the reasons we do the Boston Pledge. We do simple things, humble things, hopefully 1 at a time, 2 at a time, 10 at a time. So in that spirit now, I would like to invite you to join the Boston Pledge. You are in Boston and we could take the needle forward. So I think we should try to wrap it up.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a point to make.
Yes, please. Quickly.
Sure.
Yes.
So what I could grasp from this session is until we become a problem, we are capable of solving any problem that may come. And if I have to take one learning from all these speakers, each of these speakers, it would be we are living in a hyper-connected world, and everything is related to each other. Only the degree of relevance varies. And this is what the core of system thinking is. And I'm thankful to Professor Jerry for putting this so clearly and in such a strong way. Thank you very much. And from Nav, what I could gather is uh, we have to nurture the inherent potential lying dormant in each of us. We have to activate that. And that is how we can instigate from 0 to 1. And from Peter, I learned a very important lesson that goes like this, that calibrated tension applied by mentor stretches the limit of mentee. That is how we nurture the talent. And we have to address the human factors involved while we are trying to solve the problems around. Many a times we just address the problems on the superficial material layer, on the just materialistic level, where ignoring the vital human factors. That is the purpose of life. Many a time, if we are able to convey, this is what my understanding is, if we are able to convey the real purpose of life, then the whole dimension gets shifted. We add another dimension to the very existence of that person, then who becomes the real problem solver. Thank you very much.
So, Partha, at this point, shall I conclude, or Partha, you're muted. So I think Partha is in a hyperspace right now, in a really highly heightened creative mind. Partha, you have been muted, and we did not get the chance to listen to your insights.
Oh, no. I am in trying to follow Peter's formula, and I have to ensure that I keep myself muted. So
I thought that you are communicating with higher spirits for more guidance. You know?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I didn't want to intrude on his karma at that moment.
No, I was just following Peter, that's all.
But at this point, let me thank all the participants, especially the speakers, and for a great enlightening discussion on creative problem solving. Fascinating ideas have come out, and I'm going to invite Devendra to close the session.
I think Jahangir,
yes,
I was thinking it'd be good, appropriate for Ing to close the session, because Devendra made some closing remarks.
Yes.
So as a sponsor, Ing,
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Partha. Well, I don't know what to say. I mean, my words will pale in comparison to the richness of the discussion from all the great minds. So I wouldn't even try to embarrass myself. Now, I have often heard that proximity to genius gives one the illusion of one's own intelligence, unlike beauty. So that must be how I'm feeling right now, because I feel wiser than I was 90 minutes ago. So thank you again to the Boston Pledge, to all the panelists and our audience. I hope we'll have the opportunity to participate in such discussions again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, with folded hands.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. We'll be doing it again. Thank you.